Now, obviously, we're first thinking about running something really, really tight. We really want to win national championships. We thought about like really liberal cases, like no death penalty, or what was running the diamond rounds, or something like that. And we decided no, that's obviously advertising. So we're going to run something that's definitely not, which is not only are we not going to have a death penalty, but we're not going to have any kind of life imprisonment without parole. In other words, we're never ever going to convict anyone without the chance of them one day getting off. Excellent. That being said, we have 3 reasons why we really fundamentally believe this is necessary to the rights of people, and we'll just be pragmatically better in society. The first thing we want to talk about is how rehabilitation is the ultimate end of the justice system. And I think it's fair to say on that side, that we really believe is that people inherently have the potential to be good, and are only evil in the sense that they fail to be good because of external circumstances, because they had a bad upbringing, or family, or because they have diseases or some kind of mental disorder, because of the fact that they're put into social circumstances that cause them to commit crime. People are impoverished in our society all the time, and they don't necessarily want to commit crime, but choose to do so because of that. Like, I don't have to commit a crime right now because I've never put in a circumstance where I ever need to. A lot of these people don't get to make that choice, and that's why they end up doing it. So, at that point,
whether or not they want to make that choice, if someone's always going to make that choice, whether or not they want to, isn't that a reason to lock them up and put them?
Don't clap for that.
So, unsurprisingly, we were going to argue that this should exonerate all people, but rather that this just isn't a problem with humanity itself, but rather a problem with society. Because human beings are just fundamentally built to be good and social creatures. That's how our species has managed to survive. So if we do have faith in some kind of fundamental nature of humanity in this respect, then we think at that point we need to recognize that these factors that cause people to commit crimes, although it can be used as a justification to put somebody in jail, at the same point we should also recognize that these factors are both temporal and external. And at the point where we realize that if that's true, a lot of these crimes come from poverty, a lot of these crimes come from a failing of society. What this means is that society has a reciprocal obligation to try as damn hard as it can to make sure it can rehabilitate people in all cases. Society in such a way to make it unfair for people that whether or not you have to put these people in jail because you just need to put people in jail, at the same time you should understand that it's not their fault and try as hard as you can to make sure that these external circumstances can be changed. And while we can recognize on our side of the house that we're not going to be able to change it all the time, and we can recognize that society isn't perfect at this fact, we think you have an obligation to try as hard as you can in all cases and should never give up on someone precisely because of the fact that they're human. The second thing I want to talk about, the second thing I want to talk about then is whose role should it be to make these kinds of decisions? Whose role should it be to decide on rehabilitation? Because we would claim on our side of the house that either way a choice is being made. Either way, a judge is going to have to say, you deserve 10 years because you committed this crime and that's how long we're going to incarcerate you. But I'm giving you 50 years or lifetime sentences or 60 years or 70 years just because of the fact that that's how long I predict it's going to take to rehabilitate you. We would claim that these judges in this position just aren't fit to make these kinds of decisions. First of all, issues that come up in trial often don't even focus on anything that has to do with rehabilitation. They don't ask you the question, what is it in you? What factors in you cause you to commit these crimes? Can these factors be changed? How culpable are you? They ask this to a marginal effect, but the main question they're asking is, did you actually commit this crime? Are you responsible in an objective sense for these crimes? Not how good can you be rehabilitated?
There are certain crimes that judges don't have to decide. It's just legislated that if you're convicted, you go to life without parole. Can't society make these sort of decisions and put this in law and then we don't have to have this?
That's an excellent argument. I hope to hear that's part of your speech. That would only be true if you believe on their side of the house that humanity can never ever be rehabilitated in those certain circumstances. That's the burden that they have, and I look forward to them defending it. But the second thing I want to say under this point is the idea that even if it is true that a judge can make these kinds of decisions, the time or the evidence was presented at trial. Just the fact that there's time disparity in the trial makes a judge impossible, it makes it impossible for a judge to decide this kind of stuff. Understand that regardless of what happens, people change randomly. Like the respondency to rehabilitation and prison seat changes from person to person. There's no way to predict these kinds of things going in. Moreover, changing certain social circumstances can often radically alter whether or not you can be rehabilitated for a crime. Like if there's drug treatment that can totally fix people that don't exist when the trial happened, but exists 30 or 40 years later, that's a great instance that we would claim you should let this guy off. At least give him the chance to be let off. And I don't think they can support just that there's never ever an instance that anybody can ever be rehabilitated. That said, our third argument is going to be the idea of practical effects, and this is kind of unprincipled. understand that apart from just having the right to do this and not being an ethical decision in the first place, there's thousands of practical benefits on our side of the house as an implementation of social policy. The first thing I want to talk about under this is probably something you saw coming, the idea of mitigating the effects of unjust convictions. Because if there are procedural failures, and understand in our society there's always going to be structural and procedural failures that make it such that people get sent to jail unfairly. If I'm in that kind of situation where society, as Marty says it, legislates that I just can't get out, that means I'm essentially screwed. I will never ever have a chance of getting out of jail. On our side of the house, you give the person that chance to prove again and again, if there could have been a procedural failure, that society is going to correct itself for that procedural failure. I think that's not okay. But the second thing I'm going to say under this is just the idea of behavior itself, right? Because I think outside of prison and inside of prison, there's horrible degenerate incentives that you're encouraging that make it such that people don't really have any reason to have hope, don't really have any reason to behave ethically. First thing under this is the idea of the sports hurt policy, and this applies to people outside of prison. If I commit a crime that I think is so horrible, that like murder or rape or serial murder, whatever socially is legislated to do this kind of stuff, then if I know I can go to jail for the rest of my life, if I know that I'm caught, if somebody puts me up, then I'm dead, essentially, to society, then I will do whatever I can not to be caught. I have no reason not to stop killing people, not to stop brutally enforcing my will, just as a matter of respecting my own. But the second thing under this is the idea of behavior in prison. Understand that right now, criminals have just no incentive to be good under prison because they just have no hope of getting out. These people who don't have a chance at parole have every reason not to be nice to guards, not to be nice to their fellow inmates. What this means is all these things are happening their involvement in the system. Families of the prisoners, or families of just the guards, or the guards themselves, all are put at risk because there's no incentive to behave. That's a horrible thing on their side of the house. But the last thing under this, and this is what I'm going to close on, is the idea of resources. Look, we're not arguing to let people out just because of the fact that, you save resources on this. Obviously you can, because letting people out costs, like keeping people in jail obviously costs a lot of money. But if you believe on our side of the house that paroles do have the ability to decide whether or not somebody is guilty, do have the ability to make these kinds of determinations, then I think you have an obligation to society not to waste the government's resources in putting somebody in jail, somebody who doesn't need to have the benefits of society. And for that reason, we need to
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, members of the panel, everyone here. This is so exciting and amazing. Thanks to these guys for an outstanding performance and an outstanding tournament. We're just great. So, and Marty, for 4 wonderful years, I got choked up saying it 6 rounds. Been wonderful. So, I want to start off by asking kind of an important question. Why is it that we actually even have sentences in society? Because they paint this picture that the criminal justice system is basically just about rehabilitation. And I think that's really what they want to focus on more of this. But I want to ask, why is it that we even do sentences? Do we say, this is what you're going to get for this particular crime? That what the legislature says, this is what you're going to get if you do this sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of reasons why we do this. If we simply believe we should put someone in prison until they're rehabilitated, we wouldn't sentence people. We'd find them guilty, put them in prison, and wait until they were rehabilitated. That's not what we do. So the first thing I want to talk about is the nature of deterrence. Now, I know that sometimes these arguments can be made in a way that's just ridiculous. And I don't want to make this in the ridiculous sort of way. But I do think that the threat of life in prison without parole is a threat that people will take seriously. I think that a lot is made in society of the fact that oftentimes people who get a life sentence with parole oftentimes get out, not after that long, right? You hear horror stories about after 8 years or something, which really doesn't seem so bad. But the nature of life in prison without parole is a terrible idea that I think would deter anyone. And any rational actor. Now, a lot of these people aren't rational actors, but some of them are, and I think it has that deterrent effect. That's why it's important to set a boundary saying, this is what you will get in these particular circumstances. Also, I want to talk about the nature of retribution, because that's what they're going to call it, so I figure I may as well preempt their terminology. But I think that there's that notion of kind of getting one's due. And I think that we accept this in society. It flows with our intuitions. The reality is, we're horrified when we see some crimes committed. And I think that they're going to say, why is it that they're going to try and put some burden on us to create a justification for this intuition. I'm not sure that that's fair. I want to put a burden we need to prove this analytically or something. I think that generally, all things considered, we should take that intuition at face value. But also, I want to put this in terms of the family's victims. Because I think a lot of times, victims' families or victims themselves will feel horrified at the notion that someone could get out someday. I think that it's terrorizing to them psychologically to have that happen. And I think it really is a good motivation to tell someone, look, you can sleep at night because this person will never ever be a member of society again. I think that it's perfectly justified because, I mean, clearly they violated the social contract in adequate ways or whatever else we want to talk about. And I think at the point where it's justified, I think that it's reasonable to make this sort of judgment in order to say, you can sleep at night, we'll let you be free. Then the last thing I want to talk about is the fact that some people just can't be rehabilitated. Now, I can't give you psychological evidence for this. I feel like that's really the type of question that we probably would want to have bear on this round. But the reality is, my intuition goes that a lot of people simply are deranged. And I'll get to their first point in a second, but I think society sometimes does create what we often call monsters who just aren't going to get changed. And I think that means that precisely that, you know, these people can't be rehabilitated, rehabilitation could never apply to them, and similarly, parole could never apply to them. Sure.
Okay, maybe that's true, Nico, but do you think that you can determine that purely on the basis of the crime that they've committed, or does that involve other factors, like things about their moral upbringing, things about their soul that you can't possibly know?
I think at some point you can say anyone who does X has such and such condition. I mean, the psychologist is really operating on the same principle at a smaller level. They're analyzing them saying if they do this, then they have such and such psychological. What's happening in this case is we're saying if someone does X, Y, and Z, they simply can't possibly be rehabilitated as a blanket rule, more or less. If someone goes around doing this, like, horrible, horrible things repeatedly, and they're not insane, right? These are people who knowingly did this, then I think that at that point we may be able to make a blanket judgment. I mean, psychological evidence may suggest that we can make a blanket judgment, that these people simply can't be rehabilitated. So I go to case study because I think there really isn't that much here. They talk about how rehabilitation is the purpose of punishment, and how it's a failure of society, it's a failure of the circumstances, that we should do everything we can to correct. I first of all, of course, agree that we should try and do everything we can to correct people. But at the point where we think that this person can't be corrected, that's a different situation. But I want to kind of challenge the underlying premise here, right? Because their argument is, well, it's a failure of society, so we should sort of try and go easier on them and give them this option. I'm just not sure if that's right. Imagine society creates a real monster, let's call it Godzilla, and it just goes around terrorizing society. It's a sentient being, it deserves rights and so on. But it terrorizes society. I think the fact that society created it wouldn't change the fact that we should put it behind bars and not let it. I'm just not sure that the fact that society created this means that we should somehow give them a better deal. I just don't think that really makes sense. Then they say, who decides this? The judge can't make this decision. Well, I think Marty's COI is just correct on this. Society makes laws, and they assign punishments to those laws. It's determined by the legislative process. The judges are simply applying that process. So either they've said, you get this if you did this particular action, in which case it's procedurally just, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. Or the judge is interpreting the law in some particular way. But again, I think that the judges are in place to make that sort of decision. I don't know why we would think otherwise at all. You have to kind of buy this whole psychological argument for me. And then they talk about how, what if in the future there are drugs that can make people perfectly rational? I think this is an adequately silly argument to be mocked, right? The reality is that, if we got drugs that automatically rehabilitated people, I think we would have to radically change our justice system. I'm not sure that we would sentence people. I'm not sure that we would have juries. I really don't know what we do at all if we had this sort of situation. But I'm sure that we would just have to change our sentencing guidelines a little bit. The last argument is about how the practical effects and how some people are unfairly put in prison because of procedural problems. If there's a procedural problem, we have an appeals process. That's very different. The parole system is not in place to correct procedural injustices within the justice system. Then they talk about how there's going to be these incentives for the individual actors. There's going to be this scorched earth policy. Now, I think what's interesting here, because I'm sure that one of the biggest things they're going to get up here and say about deterrence is that these people aren't rational actors. But this argument treats these individuals as extremely rational actors, making subtle decisions about how much penalty they'll get for particular things. And I think that that's somewhat strange. Moreover, I also don't think that, I think that that's one of the reasons why we would actually have one of these punishments. Then they talk about how behavior in prison needs to be, promoted in some sort of way. First of all, deal with the problem at that level. I think that you can have criminal offenses for people who do criminal things within prison. You can also, put them in cells and, make sure that they are coerced into doing good things. That's what prison does after all. I mean, try and deal with prisoners is the way that prisoners should be dealt with. And then the last argument they talk about on case is the waste of resources. I think that the biggest waste of resource will be every 3, 5, whatever years, having parole hearings for people who we know have no chance of ever getting. If you want to save resources, which is probably shouldn't be about, but if you want to save resources, then I think it's obvious that you would not have these parole hearings. We oppose.
Thank you everyone who's watching here. I'm not sure how the hell I got to Nationals Finals, but hey, I'm here, I love it, it's fantastic. Now, I'm going to start the way I start every other debate round, because I guess this is still a debate round, even though it's Nats Finals, so with a little bit of an overview. And my overview here is that, while their side essentially assumes that there are some people who are untreatable, some people who will always be criminals like for the rest of their lives, and there's no way that any treatment can absolutely positively help them out. Now, I don't know that that's true. I don't think it's true, right? I think that in this round, I'm really arguing about something that I believe. It's not something I can prove, but I'm not telling you that you can prove it one way or the other, right? I don't think they can give you constructive argumentation that someone, just because they committed a certain offense, will never ever be reformed. Even if they find God, even if they find love, even if they have more and better therapies and behaviors. They say it's ridiculous to assume that you're going to find a drug that cures criminality. That's true. It's ridiculous to assume that you're going to find a drug that cures all criminality. But we might find a better way of treating criminality. We might find better psychological methods for dealing with people's emotional disorders. I don't have to argue that you're going to have the perfect rehabilitation pill to understand that it's difficult to understand whether a person can or cannot be rehabilitated. They can't give you a standard. They cannot simply assert, well, we feel there are some people that because they do X action will never ever be reformed. Look, we don't believe that's true. We don't believe that you even know it. But even if these people will never be reformed, they haven't given you a harm to having these parole hearings at least trying, right? All they do is there might be some ways to honestly, yeah, you can't do it every year. That's true. There are certain things you have to spend money on. But if there's one thing that I'm willing to spend a couple extra dollars on in my society is ensuring that people who are no threat to anyone else who could be good and productive members of society have a second chance. Can't actually get out of prison. I'm willing to spend more money on that. I'm sorry these guys aren't. They're good people in general. They're arguing you decide because they're on it. No thanks. That said, let's look to the points that the Leader of Opposition brought out. I think they're very, very interesting. I think they go to the clash of the round. They're very good points, but we simply believe the other side. The first thing that they ask is, why have sentences, right? Because he says, well, why not just keep people in jail until they're rehabilitated? Well, to a certain degree, for very heinous crimes, that's essentially what we're arguing for, right? So to simply say, well, why not just keep murderers in jail until they're rehabilitated? Well, yeah, that's our side of the house, right? And I'm really upset you guys just clap for the other side. That doesn't say good things about this round. But the second thing he talks about is deterrence. And he says, look, you want to have a deterrent. Putting people in jail for a really long time encourages other people not to go to jail. Now, I agree that deterrence is a benefit. I agree that it's very handy to put people in jail because it convinces other people not to commit crimes. But I don't believe that deterrence is an end in and of itself. I think that if you believe that deterrence were an end in and of itself, you would justify, for example, putting innocent people in jail, in a very high-profile case, because that tells you that justice is always served, right? You justify things like Japan. In Japan, they have huge procedural justice problems. They have a 99% conviction rate because they believe in deterrence like this. I don't think you want to justify purely draconian methods, putting a whole lot of people in jail and ensuring that cops are invaluable just because people won't commit further crimes. Deterrence is certainly helpful, but it's not an end in and of itself. The second thing they talk about is retribution. They say, look, there's some kind of sense in which people need to get their due. And we can't argue for this, but you guys believe it. Firstly, I don't think that we should just act on these kind of pre-moral, just irrational notions of we need to harm someone who harmed me, right? That kind of logic, that kind of eye for an eye, he hit me, he hit me, so I need to hit him back harder, is not something we should implement in our society, right? Like, often if someone did something very minor to me, like let's say they stole my car, I might want him to be killed. That's not a rational behavior. That's an irrational reaction to like the circumstances of the crime. You shouldn't justify when it's essentially like a legal form of that. But also what I would say, like in response to this, is maybe you would believe this at the time, right? Maybe immediately after the crime was committed, I feel the guy like should be in jail for like 60 years, like 80 years, like for the rest of his natural life. I don't know that everyone would feel the same way 40 or 50 years later. When the guy's an old man, he's sitting in jail, he's read a lot of books, he's suffered quite a bit, I don't know that you would necessarily feel that he deserves that anymore. I think it is just an emotional response. It's tied to like the emotional nature in which we treat crime. It's tied to the way in which like we feel harms, but I don't think it's something rational. I think society needs to be rational about these things, or else like we can't have justice in the world. No. So, the next thing to talk about is the victim's family. Again, I don't think this is an end in and of itself. Yes, it really sucks for the victim's family if the guy gets out of jail, but like I don't think we should be punishing people purely on the basis of what the victim's family wants. Like clearly the victim's family might want a really, really severe punishment in like cases where they don't deserve it. Like that's not an end in and of itself. Sure, Marty.
Okay, maybe not just the victim's family, but what about in the case of rape, where someone's been raped and they're psychologically traumatized by the fact that this person might be out on the street again one day and might be able to rape them? Isn't that enough of an impact to say that person should go to jail for committing such a heinous crime so that an innocent person isn't traumatized forever?
Honestly, I understand. The emotional impacts are really, really bad, but just because someone reacts to this in a particularly emotional way doesn't mean you throw a person in jail even if they're not affected. Like, it sucks, you're right. But honestly, like, if I go down to Harlem and, like, I get my car stolen, again, like a bad example, I'm really paranoid about the car, my parents just bought it for me, right? And I get my car stolen, I might be really, really traumatized by that, right? Like, obviously not the same as rape, but, like, I think in cases of, like, okay, better example, let's talk about rape. I think in cases of rape, the victim might actually want the person to be killed. We don't have the death penalty for rape. If you want to go based on like the purely emotional reaction, we always kill the victim. Raping someone is one of the most horrible things you could possibly do to them. Like the emotional reaction may very well be infinitely bad. I don't think you can justify things purely based on that. The next thing to talk about is that like, what was it? Just can't be rehabilitated. Some people just can't be rehabilitated. That there is some combination of X, Y, and Z that if you do X, Y, and Z, then like you can never possibly be rehabilitated. I think, and not to be a prick here, there's a reason they said X, Y, and Z, because I don't think they can come up with an example of 3 things that if you do, there's no way you can ever get rehabilitated. But further what we talk about is exigent factors. What we say is, if exigent factors can make me into a criminal, then I think you almost have to believe that exigent factors can make me not a criminal anymore, right? I think it's like rational approach, right? If maybe a lack of a good upbringing, like a lack of love, and like severe brutality can make me into a bad person, then maybe love and kindness and religion and like rationality and learning can make me not a criminal anymore. Like, maybe it doesn't occur in all cases, but I think in some cases it absolutely does. So that said, let's look at the arguments that we bring up. I think they're really important. I just think they're true. The first thing we talk about is that rehabilitation is the ultimate end of the justice system. People do bad things because of circumstances, and like when you recognize that the construction of society does create criminals, we think that society has a reciprocal obligation to try to make them not criminals anymore. Like to a certain degree, social ends have made the person into a monster. If society makes a person into a monster, I think that same society has an obligation to do its best to make them not a monster anymore. To a certain degree, society has created these people and has an obligation morally to uncreate them given what it has done to them. His response is, well, what if Godzilla levels Japan? Okay, if Godzilla is rational, if you can negotiate with Godzilla, if Godzilla only leveled Japan because Japan like made a bunch of really bad movies about him, then maybe throw Godzilla in jail. And like if Godzilla becomes like a pacifist dinosaur, let him out of jail. Whose role should it be? We say, look, judges can't make this determination. It's better made by parole boards. I think this makes sense, right? It's easier for me to determine after the fact, examining a person's behavior in prison, the things they tell me, like how they've acted after the fact, whether they've actually reformed, than 20 years before the fact saying 30 years of prison, like 20 years of prison, this will necessarily rehabilitate them. It's just easier to make this determination. But also, what Bonnifield tells you is that, like, look, a lot of these factors just aren't brought up in trial. Responses to rehabilitation are largely due to upbringing, they're due to personal preferences, they're due to ideology, like religion and stuff like that. These are not examined in trial. They don't search your soul. They ask, did you commit the crime? If you don't examine the very things which determine your response to rehabilitation, how can you determine when you're going to be rehabilitated? Nico's response is, but they're just applying the law. The judges are just applying the law, and that's good. Okay, maybe the law is bad, right? Like, do you really think that legislatures, totally removed from circumstances, can always decide that if something happens, a person deserves 20 years of jail, right? Like, particularly people who are elected on being more tough on crime, that's ridiculous. The other thing we say, and that's pretty much what we say here. Oh, we also talk about drug rehabilitation. We also talk about more effective treatments, right? And they say, you're not going to get a drug that's going to cure crime. As I said before, you might get a drug that cures emotional disorders. You might get better treatments. Like, there's certainly a possibility that we will get better at rehabilitation. We're clearly better than they were in like the 1890s where they just like flogged people, right? The last thing we talk about is benefits. And we say, look, this mitigates the impacts of unjust imprisonment. And Nico's response is, well, we have an appeals process for that. And that's true. Like, this was not the original aim of the parole board. But what we're... But, you know, one of the things that really bothers me about these guys is that they make the argument that because you weren't created to do this, it's bad if you do. Like, I don't think that that's true. Like, understand that the appeals process only applies in circumstances where I can find evidence that I didn't commit the crime, right? This is not true in all cases. Sometimes there just isn't any positive evidence that can prove I didn't commit a crime. At that point, I'm still going to be in jail. The appeals process can't get me out because there's just no way to prove I didn't commit it. This is an entirely different determination.
He's like 1.5 over.
Well, in that case, I'll let Bonnifield deal with this because I honestly think all of this is in case anyway. So, thank you, we propose.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, members of the panel, this most august house, this most august panel, Nico for 4 wonderful years of debate, and these guys who are really great friends. All right, I have 2 independent points and an observation to add to the flow before I go over the flow. The first thing I want to talk about is what is parole? Because I think that the fundamental question we need to ask in this round is what is parole, what should it be, and what does society owe inmates? Because basically what Nico and I would tell you is parole is not some sort of right. It's not something that people just get by virtue of the fact that they're a person. Parole is a socially utile construct that the state has a right not to give people. That the state has specifically because it has the practical benefit of saving prison pace and recognizing rehabilitation, which is a part of the justice system. But we don't think this is any sort of natural right or natural arrangement. And I think if we can prove that it's not utile in this case, and that some people just can't be rehabilitated, we win the round. So first let's talk about why some people can't be rehabilitated. Because essentially, what Roth gets up here and he says is, look, okay, we can't prove to you that people, they can't prove to you that people can't be rehabilitated. But Roth also can't prove to you that people can be rehabilitated, right? I think we all need to talk about intuitions here. And I think our intuitions say that there are certain things that people do that say they can't be rehabilitated. For example, sometimes murderers confess and they say, shit, if I am out in society, I'm going to murder people for the rest of my natural life. On their side of the house, every 2 years we must have a parole hearing for this guy, waste the parole officer's time, and try to give him parole where he might get out. We think that's really bad. Okay, I'll take it.
Okay, so you argue that we can't prove that people aren't inherently evil and there aren't people that can't be reformed. We didn't say that. We said that that people can be reformed in some circumstances. You can't prove on your side of the house that there are people who can't be reformed if they do X, Y, and Z.
Okay,
maybe we should err on the side of caution, folks.
Okay, I'm going to get to that point in about another second. But essentially what you just said is, you can't prove what we can't prove what we can. Look, no one can prove shit in this round. This is all based on intuitions. But the second thing I want to talk about is why we should err on the side of caution, but not in the direction that Roth takes. Because I took a psychology in the law class, and one thing that I learned is people who are really, really bad criminals, people who are hardwired to do this stuff, are really freaking good at tricking parole boards. Let's take example of people like Ted Bundy, people who have killed people time and time again. They really have some crazy psychology within them that makes them so good at what they do. The reason why serial killers are the way they are is because of their psychology. And part of that psychology is the way they read people, the way they're able to select victims, the way they're able to get some pleasure out of what they do. Those skills, what makes them a good, successful serial killer, what allows them to kill 10 people without getting caught, also makes them good at reading parole boards, knowing exactly what to say to get back out in society. So I think the harm of having this is there will be more murderers on the street. Maybe it's just me, but I think if there are 3 more serial killers out in society and 50 more people die on their side of the house, we win this round. Okay, that said, let's look at what Nico touched on. So the first thing Nico talks about, or first let's look at Rob's overview. So Rob's overview is okay. We assume that some people are unrehabilitatable, but they can't prove this. I've already sort of addressed this as an assertion. They can't prove that everyone's rehabilitatable. I think we can prove this to some extent, right? There's lots of statistical analysis that says that sex offenders oftentimes are going to recidivize forever. You do have people who are recidivist criminals who commit 3, 4, 5 crimes. Fine, Rob, maybe we can't prove, but beyond a certain point that they're not going to commit another crime. But if you've committed like 10 crimes, I think that we should probably know that like you're probably not going to be rehabilitated. Also, I think this doesn't address the notion that there's certain crimes that if an individual commits, they really are so grotesque that we don't want them back out in society. Things that are like heinous rape, torture, murder, when people do those things, we don't think they have the capacity to be rehabilitated. I don't think we need to prove this. I think I'll trust all of your intuitions to know that this is just true. But the next thing Rob says is, okay, like psychological methods we can have psychological methods to deal with criminality. I've already addressed why this isn't sufficient. Why a lot of these times, even in spite of these psychological methods, people are going to get back into society. But then Roth says, what's the harm of the hearings? Okay, first of all, Nico talks about costs, right? Even if every one of these people is like actually going to stay in jail, then you have the massive cost of like having this gathering of people every year to decide this. But I also gave you the social cost of having people back on the streets that are going to commit more crimes, that are going to commit murders, and some of the most dangerous criminals will get back out on the streets. Okay, so the first thing Nico talks about is like, if we believe this, why would we sentence people at all? And Rob just doesn't understand this point. What Nico's saying is, look, if everything they're saying is true, and we really believe rehabilitation is the most important thing, then we wouldn't necessarily have a sentencing system. We would look at everything on a case-by-case basis. But the reason we have sentencing laws is because we recognize that we need to treat people like in a uniform way sometimes. That there's certain crimes that mandate certain sentences. And even if I'm going to be rehabilitated in 5 years, we think in general everyone takes 10 years, so even if I'm a little bit fast in being rehabilitated, I still have to stay in prison. That's Nico's point. They don't really understand it, and I don't want to hear Bonnifield try to like, come up with something new and deal on it. But the next thing we talk about is deterrence. And this is the biggest straw man in the room, where he's like, okay, well, deterrence isn't an end in and of itself, because we don't throw innocent people in jail. I mean, congratulations. Obviously, it's not an end, like the only end of the justice system. Like, we're not going to sacrifice other things for it. But that doesn't mean it's not something that we consider when we're thinking whether or not people should be in jail. And I think it's pretty intuitive that like going to jail without parole for the rest of your life is more of a deterrent than not going to jail without parole. That 25 years is more of a deterrent than 10 years. That's why we have these sorts of things. And I do think there are certain crimes that we want to deter to the extent that we actually would have prison without parole. But the next thing we talk about is retribution. And Rob just gets up here and he's like, okay, if someone steals my car, I might want to kill them and I shouldn't be able to do that. Okay, fine. Like, we're not talking about like stupid retribution or vindictive retribution. We're talking about retribution that like maybe society has for the fact that someone's been harmed. That when someone is harmed in a certain way, we need to inflict a reciprocal harm on someone else. I think this is a basic principle of justice. And I think certain crimes are have such a massive social harm that we do want to put people in jail for the rest of their lives. And that I think is an important point, sure.
How is that not an emotional reaction to the gruesome nature of the crime?
Okay,
you say it's a basic principle of justice, but just because you assume it doesn't make it true.
Okay, it sounds like a visceral reaction, but I don't necessarily think it is. I think a lot of times it's a sociological response to other factors, and I don't know why you're just asserting it's emotional. But the next type of retribution that we talk about, I don't think Rob understands at all. And this is where we talk about victims' rights, and this is the rape example. What Nico and I tell you is, sometimes it's bad because someone commits a crime and that victim's going to have to see that person in society again, especially if like they murdered their brother or like raped their mother or raped them or something. The response is, well, if they rape them, they might want them killed. Okay, that's an argument against the death penalty. Understand, we're not arguing for the death penalty. Maybe this is an argument for the death penalty on some level, but not really. What we're saying is we can still have all the benefits of the death penalty without any of the harms by putting them in jail. That person now knows that they're not going to have to see them again. We don't have to kill them to get those benefits. That's just a strong argument. The last thing we talk about is how some people can't be rehabilitated. Again, they're like, how do you know this? Okay, I don't know how you know that some people, like, I think that honestly we just have to appeal to intuition here. I think I've given you a lot of compelling examples. I think there are certain things that are so gruesome that we understand these people can't be rehabilitated. That said, let's go back case side. The first thing they talk about is how rehabilitation is the ultimate end to the justice system. I mean, this is just an assertion, right? It's one of many ends, but I don't think it's like the only end. I mean, I think that's why we talk about all the other ends in every round. But then they don't understand Nico's Godzilla example. Now it sounds a little funny, but if you take their logic and extend it to the point that Nico did, you see why this argument's actually just silly. Because what they tell you is, okay, society, when they construct things, they made the problem. So like, we can't stop anything because society has some obligation to stop things. What Nico tells you is, look, if society built this monster that was going to do something no matter what, there's not really any social obligation to do anything but detain it because it's going to do bad things. Like, fine, maybe society screwed it up, but that doesn't mean they have an obligation to go out and do things. We just don't think this is true. But then they talk about how like rational persons should be thrown in jail. That doesn't really address the example. They talk about how people are fundamentally good. I think we've sort of responded to this already. I don't think this is necessarily true. They're just sort of asserting it. The next thing they talk about is whose role it should be to decide this, right? And we basically tell you two things, right? We say, number one, judges aren't the only people. There's a social norm that goes on. That basically, judges are not making the only decision, there's social laws. They talk about the drug thing, that's not that important. So very quickly, let's look at the last thing they talked about, the practical effects. How this mitigates unjust convictions. Folks, this is the worst argument for their side. The parole system has no impact on whether or not someone is innocent. All it's supposed to do is let people out when they're rehabilitated, but some people can't be rehabilitated. That's what we have an appellate process for. That's not a unique benefit. They talk about behavior in prison. I think we can deal with that in other ways. I think we have an obligation in society not to waste government resources. That's why you oppose, because doing this is just a waste of government resources and is going to put a lot more criminals, dangerous ones, on the streets.
Guys, this is fucking Cornell B versus 2 Harvard seniors, and they ran, I swear to God, life without parole. It really seems as if you should drop them. We all want to drop them. We can, in good conscience, drop them. Because it turns out that what they ran, instead of like life without parole, is like, is there intrinsic desert, right? For some reason they decided to frame it in terms of like, you know, we're going to apply this the way like this system might work, you know, with a board or some shit that shouldn't become relevant. So I want you to ask yourself, on what basis did the op actually substantiate all of their claims about desert? Because I really think that the problem is they buy into the gov logic all the time. They say things like, well, the thing is that this right to parole isn't a right, it's just a socially utile construct. Okay, what do you think all rights are at the end of the day other than like the right to life? The fact that we oftentimes say we kind of have rights because we don't think it's good for society for government to be able to take this away all the time. But then at the end of the day, when we're working within the justice system, you know, we have to do something other than social utility. So what I'm going to say is that the first thing that we're going to say is, or that I'm going to say, that they really around, is one of the reasons that we have desert, they claim, is intuition. Now what's the problem with that? Because we also have an intuition of, you should forgive people who aren't going to commit more crimes. Intuition can't be the rest. They're like, we'll give examples of our intuition. Alright, not only were there examples all kind of contradictory, like the Godzilla one. Like, what does the Godzilla example show you? The Godzilla example shows you that you can have the intuition that, like, people could kind of be held accountable for their actions, as long as it's socially utile, because Godzilla probably shouldn't go around destroying everything. The reason for that is because we say Godzilla is like a morally tainted agent. We just say it's bad for Godzilla to go around destroying everything. If Godzilla isn't going to anymore, then guess what? That's just as if the parole board had said, Godzilla, we're letting you go. There's nothing wrong with this. What's Marty's response? I'm not quite sure. He says that, like, just because society helped influence and create you doesn't mean we should punish you. Or it doesn't mean we shouldn't punish you. They're not saying you shouldn't punish them. They're saying punish them, we don't care. Like, we're not making claims about these people, we're making a utility claim. At the end of the day, what they're saying is, because of the fact that society helped contribute to these actions, you don't exonerate them, but at the point where you punish them and they've shown rehabilitation, at that point, what's the fucking point of keeping them punished? I'm also going to say that as a result of this, they're really left with another ground, utility. Victims' rights, society, etc., etc. At the point where they buy the utility language of other people, like victims, or, you know, society has a claim, you have to say if utility is the measure, and there's not going to be any real disutility from letting this guy go because he's not going to commit any crimes, then what's the big deal? They say some people can't be redeemed, some people can't be rehabilitated. Fine, those people wouldn't get parole. No shit. Marty, and I'm coming back, and we have to cover less than the PMR. Marty's like, well, some people trick other people. Alright, that's just an argument for why we should push back the standards for parole or make them like a bit higher. It's just pushing back the issue, it's not why they're right. Okay? Just like the fact that some people trick just means sometimes the system wouldn't work, right? It's not as if the system worked, would we actually act on that and free the people? And the last thing that they say is something about you. That's their intuition. The whole point is they explain you why that intuition is flawed. It's because people change. You can say something about the person who committed the crime, but if somebody changed, why punish them for like a past self? There are a lot of arguments to make on this one. I believe in that, but
case statement and the arguments for the case were like different ranks. The case statement specifically dealt with things like life in prison. But all of the arguments were things like retribution is always bad, it's just irrational. Deterrence is immoral. The sole purpose of the justice system, quote from PMC, is solely rehabilitation, and therefore anything else is an invalid use of justice. Okay, there's two cases. Case A is they actually believe and are willing to defend the idea that yes, you should only use rehabilitation, and retribution is never okay. If they believe that, then it might have been nice to hear, case statement that they actually believe this, and we could have had the round about the substantive issues involved in that. Things like, is it okay for like a shoplifter who's never going to be rehabilitated to be in prison forever? Or like the murderer who like randomly kills someone and then becomes rehabilitated the next day. Is it okay to send him out to prison the next day? It would have been nice for that to have been the case statement so we could have had the round instead of like this ambiguous case statement only dealing with the narrow case of life in prison. But if it's case B, then I think it's okay to have some retribution, but simply this is too much retribution, right? Like maybe 40 years of retribution is okay, but really a life sentence isn't okay. If that's what they meant, then A, I would have liked to have heard some, arguments about why 30 years in prison is an okay bit of retribution, but like 70 years isn't an okay retribution. The mere fact that you can be rehabilitated, at the point they recognize that retribution is okay, at the point they recognize that even if they're rehabilitated in like 5 days, they should still stay in prison for a certain amount of time. They're admitting, if they believe this, that there should be retribution. That it's not just at the point they recognize that it's okay if they're rehabilitated to stay in prison, the case boils down to 40 years is okay, but 7 years is not okay. Now, okay, first of all, they don't really make any arguments trying to address the intuition at all. They just sort of say it, and I think these guys make very good arguments. For instance, like the really bad people argument, like the Osama argument. Like if Osama is caught, I don't want him on parole someday. It's just a visceral reaction. First of all, I don't think that my visceral reaction to Osama will change in 20 years. I'll dislike him then too, right? And second of all, why is it bad to make moral statements? It's true, the idea, proving from a prima facie sense, in priority or factory or whatever weird philosophical terms you guys use in your philosophy classes, proving that Osama bin Laden is inherently bad, maybe a little bit hard, but I think it's okay to trust my moral intuitions that he should lounge himself as squirrel away his bank accounts on some beach someday that what he did was sufficiently bad and he doesn't deserve parole. At the point that the round comes down to is it okay, is retribution okay for life as opposed to 30 years? They don't make arguments about why 30 years should be the limit rather than life, and our intuition very strongly go to the idea that it should be life in cases like that. I see no reason to side for the government in this round when the case statement didn't really make it clear what they were arguing. But finally, victims' rights. It's true, right? On the one hand, victims' rights is important on their side of the house. On the other hand, well, maybe they'll be rehabilitated. But it's a balancing act. But which side of the balancing act is better? The side of the rape victim who's constantly tormented by the death or the side of the horrible rapist not murdered is really bad, right? At the point that we're trying to balance out the rights of people, which side would you rather take the balance of? The torment of the guy who committed the murder and wants to sun himself on some beach someday, or the guy who's actually been murdered? It's true there's a balancing act, but it seems obviously clear that their side is stronger than the balancing act. Ultimately, I wasn't sure exactly what the case statement was, and for either case statement, I think that the opposition won the round. Thanks.
Crossbench speech.
Somebody who steals things is not going to steal things in prison because there's nothing really to steal. There are no Like, that's the sort of thing that actually goes on. And I would say that when crimes are egregious enough, the problem with letting somebody out and letting them do this again is so bad that it's not okay. The balance of rights is in the favor of society. But what is opposite is sort of ridiculous? Because Op gets up here and talks about moral intuitions. And I really like talking about moral intuitions. I think they're a good starting point, right? But they're not a be-all, end-all. The reason we have a society and a justice system is because our moral intuitions and what we just kind of feel and our base emotions aren't things which you can base a justice system on. Like, if I were going on my moral intuition, I would support Psycho. Why? Because I want somebody who rapes my sister or who kills somebody close to me to get out of prison so I can whack the bastard myself. Examples, and sort of like the only example is right is Godzilla. But look at sort of the real life examples. If somebody close to you was actually harmed in such a terrible way, if you knew that somebody, after being paroled once, twice, 3 times, had continued doing something so horrible as like treason, like realize that what they're talking about is don't prosecute the Rosenbergs, it's okay, they probably won't sell nuclear secrets again. Like, it's okay, don't worry, he can't kill his wife again for cheating on him. That's the sort of thing which you really have to understand doesn't make sense in our moral intuitions on either side of the house. At the end of the day, both sides sort of assert these purposes for the justice system, but the actual purpose is to prevent crime and to sustain rights. That's a balancing act sometimes. And both sides of the house have made a lot of absolutist assertions without really understanding that there are some cases where these people can't be let out and some cases where maybe they can. Just realize that neither side of the house has really proven their side, and a lot of these arguments that each side has like based their pony on are really kind of ridiculous.
Thanks to everyone again. So I want to start out by characterizing, I think, what their case really comes down to, which is you should have a right to go free whenever you've been rehabilitated. Whenever you won't commit a crime, you have a right to go free. I think that's essentially what they want to defend. But I think we basically asked them, why do you want to defend this at the beginning of my first speech, when I said, why do we have sentencing if this is really our notion of justice? If you really do have a right to go free whenever you've been rehabilitated, why do we have sentencing? And I don't think they answered that. I think Marty gives you all sorts of good analysis to thinking that parole is a privilege. It's something that we give because we have good reasons to give it, but it's not something that we have to give. It's not something that I can demand as soon as I can tell the state, truly, that I can go out and not commit any more crimes. I don't think that it's something that prisoners have a right to demand. It's a privilege that we give based on social utility. I think that's pretty clear. So that being said, we have to ask, is this a good, how should we distribute this privilege? How should we kind of dole this out? And I think that at that point you need to weigh the harms and benefits, basically. The benefits that they get are all the things at the end of their case, which, quite frankly, I think are pretty trivial, and which Rob drops in the MG. The reality is, there aren't these like big social benefits that you're going to get from having this particular situation, right? There aren't any clear social benefits that you get from giving out this privilege. But what you do get are a lot of harms, and Marty and I talked about this pretty consistently. Some of them are more trivial, like the cost of having these hearings, pretty trivial. Or the deterrent effect, which I admit would probably be somewhat small, but there's still a deterrent effect. And I think that's a harm that you're taking away by not having the system. Thirdly, I think there's the victim's rights point. And I think this is where we start getting into things that really are substantive. Because I think at the point where we're questioning, do we give out this privilege to someone? And if it's going to hurt someone who's an innocent member of society, I think we don't give out that privilege, precisely because we think that it is the victim's right to get some sort of like psychological sanity. I think it precisely is their right, and I think that is why we wouldn't give out a privilege at the impingement upon that victim. Fourthly, I'd say that the argument about retribution still kind of pulls through. Now, I admit again that I can't give you anything more than moral intuitions, but I think I gave my justification for that in my first speech. I said, look, in general, there should be a presumption in favor of our moral intuitions. And sometimes our moral intuitions go wrong. That might be right. And of course, but then they bring up this strong one, right? They say, well, what if our emotional reaction is to kill the killer or something like that? But you can argue against that emotional intuition, right? That's precisely my point. There should be a presumption in favor of it, but that doesn't mean it goes through every time. So I can give a good argument against that sort of intuition. The point is, they haven't given an argument against this intuition. They haven't given an argument against it when it makes sense that this is wrong wrong, this is horrendous. And I think at that point, there is a sense in which this is the moral thing to do. I think we shouldn't just try and make morality as something built out of some sort of pure rationality or something, as they would try and do and put the burden on us. I think there is a reason to think about our passions have some sort of good influence here. And the last thing I want to close on, and I think perhaps the biggest harm, is that it really will let killers go free. Because there will be mistakes that are made. And sometimes we need to make a blanket law saying, look, we generally think that there's no reason we should put you up for parole, precisely because even if you did trick someone, you're likely to go out and commit these crimes in the future. And at that point, we say, look, we're going to have this policy, and we're going to give this penalty to some people, precisely because if they ever got back out in society, in general, like on averages, they would commit more crimes, and we don't think society would be as safe. I think that that's exactly why we would have this policy, because we don't want killers roaming the streets. I think people will get killed if we don't have this policy. I think this makes society more safe. And I don't think giving a benefit to people who haven't necessarily earned it isn't something that countervails that. Beautiful.
The first thing I want to do is address Marty's remark, because I find it interesting. We were really expecting most of their op to be about why parole board stuff. I'm sure a lot of you were expecting this to happen. But it didn't actually come out into the MO. And the one argument that we get is kind of specious. It's not really substantiated by much logic. All he tells you is that, look, criminals are really, really sneaky. Criminals are really, really good liars. And because they're good liars, you can never trust anyone to make judgments about criminals, including parole boards, because they can get tricked. And if people can get tricked, it's unfair to let them out because they can get tricked. Understand, guys, that this is an argument against having parole boards at all. Moreover, it's an argument against juries at all. It's an argument against having any kind of sentence. If you lie in, extend it some of the time, extend it all the time. The bottom line is, if you have a problem with this, raise standards, make it harder to get out. Fix these kinds of things structurally, but as long as you're going to have to depend on people to make judgments about criminals, people to make parole boards to make judgments about criminals, you're going to have them be able to do this. So keeping in mind that parole boards necessarily are going to have to be legitimate, and if they're not, justice doesn't get served on either side of the house. I have two questions to ask you. And the first question I have is, do all people have a chance at being rehabilitated? This is probably the most important argument. Because we tell you that, first of all, Marty just says, what is parole? Because he says it's not because of personally, it's because it's socially neutral. That's the only reason we let somebody off. But obviously this ignores our analysis when we tell you that if you buy the argument that external factors cause crime, then everyone, literally everyone in society, at least has a chance of parole. If you buy that it's not because of the individual, because of something besides the individual, whether or not society has the chance right now to remove that kind of impediment, at least it means that we don't have the right to condemn somebody for life, that we have to assume that people are fundamentally good. And if society fails in causing crime, then society has an obligation to fix its mistakes whenever possible. And then they give you this kind of interesting argument, and as opposed to this, the Assam argument, I guess, which is the idea that we have intuitions that criminals are monsters. So why should you buy our analytic justification as opposed to their intuition? First of all, I just don't think this is much of a response, right? Like, I don't think it's fair to, in response to an analytic justification that I think logically makes sense, just say, well, I have an intuition that this isn't true. But as we've pointed out a lot of times, there's intuitions on both sides, right? There's intuitions that people can be forgiven, and there's intuitions that people are monsters. So this is kind of an unclear point, and there's kind of reasons on both sides. If this is true, guys, then it's completely unfair to make these kinds of decisions now. If there is a gray area, it's a horrible, horrible thing to do to decide now to condemn it. Why? Because drug treatments change, and it's not some kind of magical pill, but actual medical solutions. 40 years ago, you would say that somebody who's schizophrenic would never ever be able to get rehabilitated. We just don't know. We want to talk about rape? Guess what? We don't know that in 40 years, we won't have medical treatments to produce, impediments against people's proclivity to rape people. We don't know that you can't solve this through drug treatment. We don't know that you can't solve this through other ways. So why are you making these kind of statements now if you can still trust parole boards to do this kind of stuff in the future? Moreover, we tell you that a lot of these things have nothing to do with random factors like drug treatments, but are just based around social circumstances. Some people respond to psychology differently. Some people respond to jail differently. If this is true, let them decide later in the line. The judge is just not competent to make these kinds of decisions. Understand that if I commit a crime, it might have been a horrible crime. I might have killed somebody. I might have raped somebody. I don't know. But if I committed that crime, let's say, because I was impoverished, and because I was in a particular social circumstance where it was a crime of necessity. It's true that I still get to go to jail, and I should still have to go to jail. But if within 40 years, like my grandmother dies or something, and leaves me a giant inheritance, and removes the impediment that caused me to commit the crime in the first place, then there's no more reason to put me in jail. And if you buy the argumentation that there is a gray area, then you can never really tell. If there are intuitions on both sides, then you have to err on the side of always giving the criminal, always giving the guy put in jail a second chance, because everyone deserves that kind of thing. So I think at the point where we prove to you that everyone has the potential to rehabilitation, you have to ask yourself, is this potential worth their social cost? And their entire op has been focusing on this point, pointing out that there's a big social cost. First of all, I would just tell you that the social cost just isn't that great. They tell you that this destroys uniformity in the system, but we're fine with that, because why is uniformity good? We think that people are different, criminals are different. Judges and social legislation isn't good, because it does make blanket legislation, does make blanket judgments about these kinds of things, but it's really not good to make these kinds of judgments in the first place. Moreover, they tell you we don't have to do this every year, do this forever. I find this to be kind of a question of social policy, not really a principled argument. Like, we can argue to have this every 10 years, every 20 years, every 30 years, and we still can accrue the most important benefits. Even if we do this every 40 years, we still give criminals a reason to behave. We still give criminals a reason to stop their rampage. Maybe it's true that they're right, that criminals are marginally less likely to commit crime in the first place if there's no chance of parole. But once they commit the crime, now they have no reason to stop. And that's a giant harm. They have no reason to not plow over pedestrians in their way in a high-speed chase. They have no reason not to resist police, not to shoot at police officers once they've committed a crime. That's a huge harm that actually does cause massive psychological and actual physical harm to our society. Moreover, we talk about all the tons of reciprocal benefits that we can give you. We talk about giving people a chance to get out of jail through parole. They point out that you can do it through appeals, but if you're really concerned with saving money, and this is most of their op, understand that appeals are incredibly expensive, right? Like, one of the reasons that actually putting somebody to death costs less money than not putting them to death is because, or putting them to death costs more money than not putting them to death, is because the appeals process for death row convictions often costs like $4 to $5 million. I think parole boards are obviously less expensive than this. It's a much better solution. Moreover, we tell you if people get out of jail sooner, you save money on incarceration, and all these other... I'm closing on this. Because of all these benefits, and because the social harm make it such that you have to go with the side that best protects rights, we provide.